Hi, I'm Ted Haftegabber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
Thank you for being here, everyone. Building I drive by every day, and I think, wow, I want to go in there. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay, so I realized reading this book that I do not like to think even 5 minutes in the future. So the idea that I would think 5 years in the future or 10 years in the future was paralyzing and upsetting, and it made me rethink all the way I think about the world, and then it just gave me wings and started flying. Can you just explain to the audience about this technique?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think of the book Imaginable as an imagination training, essentially. And the core technique that you're learning as you read the book is something called episodic future thinking. And episodic future thinking is a special way of thinking about the future. So sometimes we think about the future in terms of facts, like it might rain tomorrow, or maybe in the future cars will be banned in Los Angeles. So we have these facts. But episodic future thinking is like a kind of mental time travel where we see ourselves in this future, and it's as vivid as if it were a memory that we could recall or write a journal entry about, and we make it really personal. So instead of just thinking, well, it might rain tomorrow, we're imagining ourselves, and we're really seeing all the details. Do we have an umbrella, or are we getting wet? Are we annoyed, or are we delighted by it? Who's with us? Are we rushing? Are we, and you try to feel it and hear it and smell it and taste it before it happens. And it turns out that learning to imagine the future in this way gives you just incredible, all kinds of superpowers, essentially, mental and emotional superpowers. You get better at planning for the future. You feel more motivated for the future. You are able to control your imagination in so many ways that it helps alleviate symptoms of depression and anxiety, because when you have those conditions, your imagination's kind of run amok, so you're kind of retraining it to imagine things that fill you with positive emotion or excitement or optimism. And so, I learned this technique as a futurist, which, you're trying to...
I need to talk a lot more about that label, a lot about... Yeah,
It's fascinating.
because as an actor, some of the best techniques I've learned as an actor is that when you're developing a character, you do that in the past. So you go backwards and you pick moments in your character's life and you really fill them with all the details that you possibly can and make it as real as possible. Sorry, I must be just allergic.
It's very strange.
It's very strange. I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here. I'm magnetic. But you just reading this book filled me with such. It just threw me for a loop. And yet, when I started exercising that, it felt very empowering. And it did, as an anxious person, it took away a lot of that in life. And I'm just fascinated by the research that you've done. How was that originated?
You're going to get a
teach?
third microphone
I know.
now, please.
Okay, last try. And then I'm just broken. I'm unimaginably broken. So can you talk about how you got into that? I mean, at the Institute, you talk a little bit about that? I know I'm going on tangents. We're going to talk about some books.
Yeah, sure. So, I started my career as a game designer, which is how we originally know each other.
Yes.
And I got scouted by an organization called the Institute for the Future, which I had never heard of. It
turned out sounds like a weird spy, urban fantasy movie.
Totally. I mean, they've been around for more than 50 years. They're like this really well-kept secret secret in Silicon Valley, and they invited me to come give a lunchtime talk, which I later learned is how they like find the people they think will make good futurists. They invite them to give a talk about their work. And I mean, you probably know the saying from the computer scientist Alan Kay, the best way to predict the future is to invent it.
Yes. Yeah.
So what the Institute for the Future figured out is if we want to be really good at anticipating the future, we should find people who are already having a big influence on what the future might be like. So when I was a game designer, I was running around the Game Developers Conference and all these game events saying, we need to make games that harness the power of games for good and not just to escape, reality, but to change reality. And I was on a mission. I was telling game designers we need to try to win a Nobel Prize. And, I had a vision for what games could be 5, 10, 20 years in the future. And apparently that's, part of being a futurist is not, it's not a totally objective, let me just predict what future I think is most likely, and then I'll try to be right about it. It's actually learning how to articulate transformative change that you want to be a part of making and being able to convey that world that you imagine to others so that they feel inspired to help you create that change.
It's fascinating. And for people who aren't familiar with your work in gaming, wow, this is working. How can you describe a little bit about how that future prediction works in your games?
Yeah. Right. So, when I came to the Institute, I gave my talk. I said we should make games that harness the skills and powers of gamers to try to address real world problems. And they said, well, why don't you come make some games for us? Maybe gamers will be good at thinking about the future, anticipating the future. And so I essentially invented a new genre of games that I called massively multiplayer forecasting games. And the way they work is that we would design a scenario, the researchers and I would design a future scenario, and then we would invite ordinary people to a future social network. So it would look like Facebook or Twitter or Discord, and you hang out with all thousands of people posting stories about what you did that day or asking for help or news headlines, photos, videos, except they're all fictional from the future. And so if you were playing, you would be talking about your life as an actress or as a mom, but set 10 years in the future dealing with a strange scenario. And the first big game like this that we ran was in 2008, and it was set in the year 2019, and we asked people to imagine that the world was dealing with the biggest respiratory pandemic in history.
Yeah, this just blew me away. It actually made me think you're magical. Like now that you're talking, it seems
from the future.
You're from the future. These futurist people are aliens. You're being drafted into a cabal. You need to write that novel next. Please, because this is in the book, and I mean the book feels so incredibly timely. And then when you say that in 2008 you basically predicted the COVID, can you please go into that?
Yeah, so we were running this game where we were imagining a series of compounding crises. So starting with a respiratory pandemic, and then there were supply chain disruptions, and then there was misinformation conspiracy theory called Citizen X that was spreading all this misinformation, and people were, we called it an infodemiology crisis, to go along the epidemiology crisis. And so we were asking, and we had historic wildfires on the west coast of California.
Yes, I remember. Yeah. Yes. I mean, it was just like, whoa, you really did predict the future. And how did the ultimate, what ended up happening in that game? I mean, did you come away with anything that was incredibly correlative to what is going on today, or?
Yeah, so, well, my working hypothesis when I started designing these games is that if we ask people to imagine what they would do in these types of unprecedented crises, that they might be more ready if they ever had to live through it, but we could also collect intelligence. We could use that data from that first game had almost 10,000 players. We could collect that data and analyze it for otherwise hard to predict social trends or consequences. So we tried to ask questions that would elicit useful data, like I asked the players, you've been told to quarantine for 2 weeks. Under what circumstances would you disobey? Like, why would you go out anyway? And the number one answer was for religious services or worship, right? Because it was such an important part of their identity. They felt like it was just their highest moral duty, and they weren't going to not go just because of some, CDC advice. And that, of course, did turn out to be the super spreading risk and event when things started. We had people saying, you need to pay me to stay home because I'd have to go to work. And so if you don't pay me, I'm going to go to work even if, I'm sick. We had moms saying, if the schools are closed, I'm concerned about, am I teaching my kids at home now? And of course, we saw the historic exodus from the workplace for moms during the pandemic. We had players wear masks during this simulation, which ran for 6 weeks. We're like,
in 2008. I just want to emphasize this was in 2008.
And so we asked them to wear the mask, like, wear it on public transportation, wear it to a party, wear it to work. What is it like? How do you feel? And based on what players are reporting, first of all, about the social friction, like it just felt wrong, and also they didn't have like the physical stamina to wear the mask, because we've all lived through it. It does take, you have to adjust to the feeling of it. And so, in February 2020 at the Institute, I've been getting phone calls from people who knew we did the simulation. They were asking me, like, do you have any useful data? What should we do? Because wasn't your game set in 2019 and 2020? And we're like, yeah, okay. So here's what we learned. And we said, like, people are not going to want to wear masks. It's not going to be easy. You have to get ahead of this. We have people in spiritual communities who come, priests who want to invent the future of Catholicism who come to the Institute. We were talking to them. We're like, you have to figure out how to go virtual because it's going to be the #1 super spreading risk. And you can actually go online and find this webinar that is still on YouTube from February 2020. We're like, so this is what we think, And for me, this was, it was a good indication that this methodology works. Being a futurist is weird in that you're saying all this stuff that you think might be true or useful 10 years from now. You have to stay in the career long enough to live out your forecasts and see, did it help people who were paying attention? In this case, we were able I was able to follow up with players and find out
how it impacted them long term. Do you think that the people do you have any evidence, or have you said that it has long term impact during the game and in a smaller way? Do you think that specific game had prepared anybody a little bit?
Yeah, I did. So I followed up with all of the players that I could get back in contact with. I did a survey, and what I heard was people felt like they were able to accept the reality faster. They had essentially overcome their normalcy bias. Like, if you haven't lived through a pandemic, it's hard to believe it. It's like, it just is unbelievable what you're being asked to do or what's happening. They had already they felt like they had lived through it, and they adapted faster. They weren't, on the fence. They were prepared mentally for it. And based on the conversations I had with them and the research, I do feel like many of them suffered less, in the sense that they suffered less anxiety or uncertainty, that they felt like they were able to roll up their sleeves and get on with having to deal with this new reality.
Yeah, I guess the equivalent is when you drive somewhere new, it feels like a long time, but then when you drive them the second time, it doesn't feel quite as long. It's just a psychological thing that if you prepare yourself for a stressful situation, you just kind of project yourself into it. It's less stressful in actuality because you kind of have already predicted it happening. But when you're encouraging people throughout the book to imagine 10 years in the future, and specifically imagine yourself, it is it's almost, especially coming out of a pandemic, it's intimidating, and it's a little like, well, what am I doing with my life? Where am I going to be? Do I want to be in this house? Do I want to be with this person? Do I want my child?
I have a great story about that did not make the book.
Oh, please.
And I interviewed somebody. I interviewed a bunch of my students from Stanford for this class, for this book. And one of them, she was like, you have to interview me for this book. I have the best story. Like, futurist thinking changed my life. So she had participated in a series of games called The First 5 Minutes of the Future, where it's like rapid fire. We're throwing crazy things out at you, like government mandated internet shutdown. It's shutting off for 2 weeks for cybersecurity threat. what do you do in the first 5 minutes after the internet goes out? And all you have to do is imagine the first 5 minutes. Like, how do you process this? Who do you talk to? Like, what are you thinking? How are you going to react? Because people find it easier to just think about 5 minutes. You don't have to like figure it all out. Just imagine the first 5 minutes. And so she had done a series of these 5 different first 5 minute scenarios. And she said the most amazing thing happened because of playing these games. I got a divorce. And I was like, what? Wait, what? Like, how does that, and she's like, it's great. I'm so happy. I needed to get a divorce. She said when she was imagining all of these first 5 minutes, after she did this, she's like, my husband wasn't in any of them. Like, when I thought about who I'd want to talk to or like what would be like the right, she's like, he wasn't in it. And that just made me realize that we really needed it. This has been a long time coming. And she's very happy now. I've like heard she's living, a great new best life. And
okay, so beware, you guys. So beware of this book. It could,
but like, I know it's like people don't want to get divorced, so that's not the message. But
no. But it's also like, I mean, it's nice. I think, I've been thinking about this a lot in COVID. Like, we tend not to change our lives unless there's a huge crisis, right? We're not going to make a big change. We'll probably be in a situation where we have dreams to be somewhere else, and yet unless something shoves us. That's where we have the biggest crisis points in our lives. You graduate, you get married, you get divorced, you have a child, you retire. Those big, huge upheavals in your lives are where you really grow as a person, but you're never going to do that unless you're forced to. And I feel like COVID has given us a gift in that. Yeah. A lot of people have reevaluated their lives in a lot of different ways and are leaving. I know so many people leaving LA. I know so many people changing jobs, And so we're given the opportunity to maybe have this moment coming out of, we're not, I don't know if we're in COVID or not, I don't know. But whatever we're at, we're coming out of something. And we have the opportunity. This book just feels so incredibly pertinent because we're at a turning point where we can go in some different ways that we would not consider before. And having this tool to sort of imagine yourself is a wonderful gift in that. I mean, I want to live in Spain. I'm like, I want to be in Spain. How do I get to Spain? Yes. So like it definitely made me feel a little bit more rooted in possibility. And the tools that you're giving people in this book are wonderful.
Can I speak to that? So I'm really glad to hear you say that. I've been doing futures thinking work since 2006 was when I first started. And I've never seen so much readiness to actually try to achieve transformative change, like the kind of change that you can't do overnight. Like, it really does take years or a decade to try to achieve. And I think it's because we've just lived through this evidence, this visceral evidence that we can change so much in society, so much faster than we thought possible. And there's almost like our capacity to envision change, it's so much stronger now because we have lived through it. And so all, policies that we would have described as unthinkable or transformations we would have said are unimaginable, well, we know we can do it. So, coming into the next decade, we had to make these changes now. So that was not great. We weren't necessarily making changes we wanted. But now, when we come out of this pandemic, we can use that same incredible social flexibility to do it again, but this time do it for changes that we really want.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many thought experiments and fascinating proposals. I mean, I wish do you just sit around the office just throwing something against the wall like, hey, what if? Like, is that what is that what you do?
A lot of it, yes.
Wow. Is there a guy named Ted who's like just spot on all the time? And you think maybe he has like supernatural powers?
I mean, there is actually somebody who I quote in the book. There's if anybody wants to find like who's the most uncanny futurist, his name is Jaime Cascio, and he actually he was my he mentored me and was my scenario designer on that first game in 2008. So he really deserves a lot of the credit.
What's Jaime doing right now?
What's that? What's he doing
right now?
I mean, actually, you don't. He's. he's worried about the future now. So maybe let's stay in the happy,
because
transformative possibilities.
What I do love about your book is that it is very like, wow, wouldn't that be great if everybody just decided to, give everybody food? And it's very idealistic and optimistic, which my mind never goes to. Because I have a cynical outlook in that you have to be forced to change. Like, no, again, like it's going to be really hard to change. And can you talk about in the book how you're training people to think more optimistically?
You mentioned the scenario about just giving people food. So that's actually based on a signal of change that's happening here in Los Angeles. So the way we develop future scenarios is like every waking moment of a futurist, you're collecting signals of change, which we say it's like the raw material of future forecasts and future scenarios. So like, if a sculptor works with clay and computer programmers work with code, futurists work with these signals. And signals of change are real things that are already happening that represent a new possibility, a type of change. And it could be a new policy idea, a new weird thing that all the teens are doing. It could be a new technology that's getting adopted. It could be a social activism movement. But something that's happening, and you can look at it and say, well, okay, maybe that's one organization doing it, or that's one country doing a trial. What if this were scaled up? What if it were global? So one of the clusters, and you look for signals that kind of intersect, because then you're like, oh, it's pattern. Patterns mean it's coming. So there's a cluster of signals of change around food being used in the healthcare system. So there's a movement called Food is Medicine, which is a real movement, and they advocate for insurance providers, healthcare providers, governments to provide essentially unlimited fresh produce to as many people as possible, ideally not means tested, so not just for people who can't economically afford it, but literally give everybody a tote bag or box that they can take to the grocery and fill it up with this healthy food. Because when they've done it in pilot studies, the amount of the health benefits, how much healthcare costs were lowered, it is more expensive not to do it than to do it. You could give the whole country every week, everybody in the whole family, your partner, your kids, your in-law, everybody gets their own bag and you fill it up. So what I ask people to do in the book, let's consider, is that a world we'd want to live in? The next time you go to a farmer's market or you're at the Whole Foods, imagine that you have a bag that you can fill up for free. And so we call this location-specific scenarios. You're using reality around you to help the imagination be more vivid. So I'm in the produce aisle, but I'm imagining what would it feel like if I could just have all of this for free and my kids had their own bags. How much more excited would they be about kale if it was like a supermarket sweet? Fill your bag, you got a minute, fill your bag, it's all free. So you can. It sounds like crazy, like what? Like it's going to be free now? This will never work. Economically, doesn't make sense. But then I provide with these scenarios. You always want to provide the evidence that it's possible. It sounds ridiculous, but in fact, there are movements, there are studies. The government actually has invested some money to test this in more programs, and LA has one of the biggest pilot programs. But when you start looking for these signals, it's a kind of creativity where you just suddenly realize, wait, if that's possible, just zoom it up and now see it at a bigger scale.
No, it's really, it's so stimulating and interesting. But for me, I guess my resistance is there's such fascinating ideas throughout this book. You're just going to be like, well, I never thought, well, I guess we could, and then your imagination just starts going. So they're so inspiring, and yet you think about the practical application of any of it in a capitalist society, it's just like, well, it seems like the government would have to make the change happen, and yet it feels so paralyzed to make anything happen if it's not motivated by capitalism, profit.
Yeah.
And so how, this is totally, I have to do with your book, but I just think it's like, how do you come to grips with our society, which is so profit driven, to have these interesting things happen? You'd have to somehow make it profitable for someone.
Yeah, for sure, when we imagine these futures, we're trying to understand who would be motivated to make these futures, or what would make it more, realistic or plausible. and so you do look for things like economic incentives. And another thing that we try to do at the Institute is just in terms of, is the government going to be inspired to make a change? Well, the government doesn't usually do anything unless there's demand for it.
Yeah.
So I try to introduce some topics, some issues in the book that most people are not walking around demanding change on yet, just because they're just not on people's radar. So one of my favorite scenarios in the book is about geoengineering. So
really cool.
What if, we decide we need to take slightly more drastic measures to reverse extreme heat or droughts while we do all the work of building a sustainable world and, transitioning completely to clean energy? I mean, that's going to take a while. Plenty of scientists are advocating for things like injecting sulfate particles into the atmosphere to partially block some of the sun's light. And they want to do it in a way that doesn't have dramatic consequences, although they think it might increase flooding in some regions and maybe a food security risk in some regions. So you'd have to be prepared for consequences. And also, I feel like this is the type of action you don't want one country taking unilaterally or one company doing this. We need informed consent from as much of humanity as possible. Now, the good news is we're probably not going to start doing this for another 10, 15 years if it becomes necessary. But the problem is it's illegal to even study this right now. There's the UN has put a moratorium on this research because it's considered potentially too dangerous. And so what I'm hoping is people will start to read about this and they'll think like, well, at the very least, we should find out if it is possible or study the unintended consequences now so that if we need to do it in 15 years, it's not crisis mode and we're just like, screw it, block the sun, whatever happens, happens. I mean, we want to but we need people to ask for this. We need people to ask for governments to make it legal to do this research. I mean, if you want, or if you think it should stay illegal, I mean, great. Keep have an opinion. Put that pressure on too. Right now, geoengineering, it's not politicized. There's no party message. In the future, maybe this becomes socially divisive. Certain, political actors will say this is right, and others will say, and we'll be told what to think. But we still have time to come up with our own opinions now before. It's become a socially divisive issue. And it's like that's just one example. But
there's so many wonderful examples. It just goes on, and you're just like, every single night I would read another chapter. I was like, wait, I never thought about that. This is fascinating. And really, it opens your mind to, as you said, I think especially culturally, we kind of accept what is. I think there was an interesting thing that you had about a dog, an electroshock. It was kind of a shocking experiment they did in the 60s to dogs. But it was interesting that the dogs who just thought that they were going to get hurt by the shock, there were some dogs who were able to prevent the shock from happening, and the other ones who just couldn't. And the ones who couldn't just kind of laid there and just let it happen. And I felt like that's almost like modern society. We're so inured to things shocking us, but we feel completely impotent to do anything about it. And yet your motivation of like, well, you have to teach someone that they can do something was really encapsulated the book and was very empowering in that, you kind of get down on yourself that you're not doing something about something. Well, I think it's just human nature, but also society just telling you you can't enact change, and yet your book really puts hope and optimism in these scenarios that seem a little bit hopeless. A lot of them, environmental.
One of the reviews for the book, it was in the San Francisco Chronicle, said that the book was bizarrely upbeat considering how bleak the future feels, and that it has the uncanny ability to make you feel optimistic about terrifying scenarios. And I thought
it's true.
That kinder words could not be written. That is exactly what I hope people feel, is that they have the capacity to think about things that other people would describe as unthinkable, who would say it's too hard to think about, it's too scary to think about it. I feel like we sort of cracked the code with these future forecasting games to create a psychological safe space where we are, we have enough time spaciousness, we have enough where the scenarios are written to be a little more extreme, a little more dramatic. So they're just kind of fun. You're like imagining yourself dealing with things that are so outrageous that it's actually not as scary as thinking about like a super realistic possible crisis.
Yeah, but somebody has to have, I think COVID has really also made me think more locally, or maybe just getting older, right? And the idea that you give free food away as medicine to people, well, that made me want to take my oranges and take them somewhere, my extra oranges on my tree, and take them somewhere where they would do good. And I found there are some local places that will take, people's fruit. And so, I think, yes, what was so inspiring is that when you're encouraging people to think 10 years in the future on a global scale about humanity, it does feel so empowering that it made me want to just employ things in a smaller way, but in a way that I could have control over.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, one of the things, I started doing forecasts about drone infrastructure and like what the world might be like when there's a lot more drones in the sky. And many people who played with that forecast wound up just buying a drone so they could develop a firsthand familiarity with the technology and experiment, because you can use drones for journalism, for art, storytelling. I like this idea that you don't have to like change everything, but as you start to realize, here are some of the skills or the actions that might be common in the future, like how can I play with this today so that I feel a little bit more ready? And that's, we always say like we think about the future so that we can take actions today that will get us a future we actually want, but can actually, it doesn't take 10 years to benefit from it. It's funny that I'm glad we're talking about this food as medicine scenario. I just did an interview with a psychologist for a podcast, and he said, I've been vegan for 4 weeks from reading this book. And I was like, why are you vegan? Like, the book does not have any, that's. And he's like, well, I read the food as medicine scenario, and I thought this sounds absurd. Like, I don't believe that giving people vegetables has that much benefit to their health. And then he went to all the footnotes and he read all the footnotes, and it convinced him. He's like, okay, I need to be plant-based now, because imagining this crazy future made him want to learn more about the facts on the ground today.
Well, there's also a scenario in the book about where people eating meat would develop an allergen or protein. So it basically made everybody become a vegetarian, and that really inspired me because as an aspiring vegetarian myself, it doesn't quite get there. It does. You think about the transformation of the world if Impossible Burger tasted better, or if we were able to eliminate that kind of farming, what the environmental impact would be, the economic impact on every single level of this world, because that's where we're truly interconnected. We're truly interconnected on energy and food, right? And those are the basic things we need to live. And your forecast really made me think that it's possible to even think about changing that in small ways.
Oh, well, can I tell you a little bit about that scenario? Because this is so interesting. As a game designer, you learn to play test your new games. You think something will be fun, or you think something will be easy for people to learn, but you have to get players together to play with it, and then you realize, like, they don't even understand that rule, I have to change it, or this is too hard, or they're not having fun, or they come up with a different way to play it, and you're like, that's the new rule. So I do the same thing with future scenarios when I'm developing them, and I need to see, like, does this make people feel optimistic? Are they confused? Do they understand this world? Do they have enough information to imagine themselves in it? And so that scenario is called the alpha-gal crisis. Yeah. The impetus for this scenario is that I kept hearing from people that they wanted to process this COVID-19 pandemic and answer the question, could we do better next time? If there's another pandemic in 10 or 20 or 30 years, will we do better? Will we have learned anything? And so they wanted me to come up with the next pandemic scenario. But I also knew from this playtesting process, we are way too traumatized and still in the current moment to imagine like another respiratory pandemic. I knew we couldn't be playing with that. So I wanted to have a pandemic that wasn't about a virus, that wasn't contagious. And so it turns out there is another possible type of pandemic that would be tick-borne. It wouldn't spread from person to person. It would be spread by ticks, and it would make people essentially allergic to meat, which is a real thing that's happening now. And in the southern U.S., over a third of people have already been primed. If you take a blood test, they've already had an exposure, and so if they get bit again or 2 more times, or if they keep eating a lot of meat, then they may eventually, have this illness.
Is that nature just trying desperately to cull us?
I mean, it's interesting, but anyway, so people love this scenario. I was a little bit worried that it was going to be scary. Oh my God, people love it. I'm like, why?
I don't know. It was my favorite one too. Yeah, I was just like, look, you're giving me self-discipline by giving me a disease.
So it's a constant like learning process. Is what does make people feel hopeful for the future? And what I heard from people is when they read about this next possible health crisis, what they saw was, just like you said, so much is going to change so fast. And it's not that we would get better necessarily at dealing with a pandemic, but this time we're going to really change the world. We're going to use a health crisis to fix all these other things we've been refusing to fix. And so I really do think people are hungry for to believe that there will be some momentum or tipping point that will allow us to really rethink how we do anything. Works.
Yeah. I really want to talk about urgent optimism because this is an important part of the book, and I just want you to maybe explain to the audience and talk a little bit about that, because that's as we're talking about disaster scenarios, it is that optimism that you kind of take away from the book more than anything, with all this horrible information, or good information, but you take it away with hope, and I think it is the urgent optimism that does that. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, shall we play a little game with each other, and you guys? Okay.
Sure. Okay. So I'm real pessimistic, I gotta tell you.
I'm gonna put you on the spot. I'm gonna ask you to pick a future topic, like the future of food, or the future of learning, the future of democracy, the future of climate action, the future of fashion, anything.
Okay. You want me to pick it?
Yeah, but something you think affects everyone in the room.
Okay. Let's do healthcare.
Okay, future of healthcare.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to ask everybody 3 questions about the future of healthcare.
Okay.
You too. And I want you to hold up your answer to these questions by showing a number of fingers on your hand. It'll be 1 to 10.
Okay.
So the first question. When you think about the future of healthcare and how it might change over the next decade, do you think that everything will be radically reinvented, or things will mostly go on as normal, that nothing will really change? So a 1 would be nothing changes, everything goes on as normal. 10 is everything is radically reinvented. So go ahead, think about, what would you say? What's your number? 5, 7, 3, an 8, a 10. I love it. So what I like to do with this game is, like, if somebody's like a 10, like, I definitely want to talk to them. If they're like a 1 or 2, I'm like, I want to, I want to hear from you too. So it's good. Keep an eye out for, I like the outlier numbers. Okay. So that's the first question. Second question, when you think about the future of healthcare and how it might change over the next decade, are you mostly worried or mostly optimistic? So 1 would be extremely worried, like dystopian level fear. 10 would be so excited, I cannot contain my enthusiasm for what's coming next. So what do you guys think? What are you? It's 2, 7, 5, 9. Do you work in healthcare by any chance? Hey,
yeah.
Well, how exciting is it that someone who works in healthcare?
I mean,
that's
good.
That's good.
That's a good thing.
Amazing.
Okay.
You're helping make that future.
Yeah, I love that.
So
I love that.
The third question, and by the way, this is we're getting an urgent optimism score. This is a sort of scoring.
I'm glad we didn't pick climate change or something. way more ones.
The third question is, when you think about how healthcare might change over the next decade, how much power or agency do you personally feel you have to influence how it changes? So 1 is no power, 10 is I am the most powerful person at least in this room, if not in
I would
the
say,
world.
yeah.
You're a 2.
I'm a 2.
2,
I'm pretty
3,
low on that.
3, 8, 6.
Oh, we got a healthcare professional.
7. That's good. A 2. Okay, great. So these 3 questions are the Urgent Optimism tool, and it's not a diagnostic tool, although generally if you can find a topic that you have higher numbers for, that's a topic that you likely can focus your attention to really shape the future.
Especially the one where you feel like, how can you do something? Because
Yeah.
I'm not a healthcare professional, I don't feel like I would, but there are other areas definitely I would feel like, yeah, I can make some change happen here.
Yeah, and what's nice is, when we do this together in groups, and we could do this for like, say, 10 different topics now, what we do is we look for the people who have higher numbers than we do, and we talk to them to find out, like, where is your optimism coming from? Where did your power come from? You think everything's going to change. Why? Like, what clues are you seeing? And so this becomes a way for us to expand our awareness of change that's already happening, to expand our realistic hope, to talk to people who have plausible reasons why they're excited, and to find the people who have power so we can see, is there something I could do, like taking the oranges and giving them to the world? I mean, you would probably +1 your power for the future of food.
Yeah, I would. Yeah. Because I think, again, we are exposed to global news, global information. We're connected in a way that's very intricate and very disempowering, because our ability to make change on a global scale individually is so low, and yet we're globally connected all the time. So it does feel like the more we're connected on a grander scale, the less empowered we are. And so for me, like, I don't know if I hope that that's a trend in social media. You see people being globally connected, I feel, is a phase that we're getting out of.
Yeah.
And it feels like, 5-6 years ago, I was on Discord and I was like, I just want to hang out with 1,000 people, 1,000 fans who actually I know by name. That was more, and I see that trend a lot now in social media. Twitter just started their communities thing.
Signal it
just
change.
today.
Signal it
Yeah.
change. Yeah.
So, that is interesting in that I feel more optimistic about technology in that this period that, I came to the forefront of, especially on the internet, where we're all globally connected. It was great, and then it had the turning point of actually actualizing itself, and now we're going to reverse ourselves.
Yeah.
I have the optimism in that perspective that, everybody thinking smaller and more local actually could create change long term together.
Well, this is a great example of one of the mantras of professional futurists. Like, people literally get this tattooed. They're futurists with this tattooed. Is the William Gibson quote, the science fiction author quote, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." This idea, like, you I think were invited to try this new Twitter feature, right? I think I saw
Yes,
you tweeting
communities.
about it.
Yeah.
So communities, essentially it's like private Twitter. So instead of having to have the whole world, on Twitter, I can create my own Twitter with just like 1,000 people or 10,000 or whatever it is. And it's really amazing. It's like a new dawn. We can reinvent social media and try it again. But what's interesting about it is, like, only a few people actually have been invited to play with this now.
Okay.
Yes.
I didn't know that. I just saw it on my Twitter feed. I was like, what is this community thing?
Yeah,
Like,
so you're a walking signal of change. And so it's like, this is how you practice futures work. I have not been invited to it yet. But
what?
I know.
Well,
I'll start tweeting about it. And
we
be
can
like,
start
hey.
run a group together. I don't know. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I don't think it's very useful, but it's interesting that I see that trend of this disintegration of the large. It's like the Buca di Beppo of Italian restaurants is going away, and then like the tiny 4-seat restaurant is now. That analogy doesn't work, but I do like Italian food. Anyway, should we talk a little bit? I want to know what you think we should be concentrating on for the future, because now you're magical, and this other guy who I need to know why he's depressed.
Okay. So I often get asked, what's the most important skill to develop for the future?
Yes.
So we've gone through this phase of teach your kids programming, STEM. There are all these parents at my kids' school who are 7, and they're constantly asking me are your kids coding yet? And my girls are only 7, so they're not coding yet. But we had this idea that this was going to be the skill for the future, computer programming, right? Okay, so
I have had 5 people. My daughter's going to go to Spanish immersion school in the summer because I just think learning it's LA. Like, why are we not all doing this? And 5 people have been like, well, she should learn Chinese. That's where the power is going to be. And I was like, who are you? Like, what? Why are you? She's going to be a businesswoman? I'm like, what are you? Why are you making my kid an executive? Like, but it's really interesting that anyway. Go, keep going.
One of my daughters is learning Mandarin on Duolingo, so I feel I will let her know that that's where the power is.
Okay, that's what 5 people I know think where the power is. Okay.
So what I'm recommending now, and there's a scenario in the book to encourage people to start practicing this skill now, is this skill of being welcoming. And what I mean by that is anticipating multiple possible future scenarios where people may be displaced from their homes. And it could be due to war, as we're seeing now in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It could be due to extreme climate change, and they have to migrate. And if you talk to experts, there are some very large numbers being thrown around for how many people might need to move, essentially, forced displacement, not because they want to leave, but because they have to.
Yeah.
And we don't have a great track record in many countries of being welcoming to people who have to leave.
No.
One of the stats that concerns me is in the United States, countries that experience a high influx of refugees being resettled there, gun purchases go up dramatically in the community. That, to me, that's not the global response that I would like to see if we have up to 1 billion people moving on the planet.
We have so much room for people, too. I mean, Poland has how many Ukrainian refugees had they? 2 million, I think, they're up to. And they're a small country. Yeah. And yet we're taking 100,000 people.
Yes.
It's, it is. I think it's a mindset.
So, and actually learning languages is part of a way that we might prepare ourselves to be welcoming. People who are playing with the scenario from the book are telling me they're doing things like learning how to cook foods from other cultures so that they can welcome people. Like, what are you going to bring to somebody when they move? Do you know how to cook a cuisine that might feel like home to them? Learning dance traditions from other parts of the world, learning like movies, so that if people come, that you can help them feel at home. And I think, so whether or not we have a global mass migration crisis or not, there's a lot of upside to trying to increase your global or cultural intelligence, to learn to be welcoming, to reflect on it. In the book, one of the exercises is reflect on a time that you felt really welcome somewhere. What was it about that place that made you feel welcome? And if we can build that, it's not just about like computer programming. If we could build at a population level, the ability to be welcoming, to overcome we have too much social anxiety about the movement of people on the planet. One thing we do at the Institute for the Future is we say that in order to look forward, you need to look back at least twice as far as you want to look ahead.
That's interesting because I read a lot of Greek. I have insomnia, so I read the most boring thing I can possibly before bed. So physics and ancient Greek literature. But interesting is a lot of the themes, especially if you look at the Odyssey, and welcoming and being friendly to guests is a fundamental of so much ancient literature, which is so interesting because back then there was, people's lives would be completely disrupted a lot by war and invasion. Climate change did affect a lot of people, thousands of years ago. So it's really interesting that we're now predicting that maybe we'll go back to that kind of societal need.
I love that. And as I tried to imagine the future, maybe our border policies might change, I had to educate myself. And I had this really dumb fixed notion that almost like it was some kind of a natural law, like physics, like the rules of the universe, that you enforce boundaries. And I didn't realize, you go back more than 100 years, we didn't have borders and boundaries where people had to, if you could get there, that was it, you were there. And I'm not saying we want to go back to that necessarily, but when you realize how constructed, how arbitrary, artificial the way that we live is, you realize, okay, maybe we don't want to go back to there are no borders, but we don't have to be stuck in this such a strict way of policing people's movement on the earth, especially if people are going to be, at risk, and we might want to give them, that
it would be
right
nice if ideally we gave them
a little more freedom of movement. Yes,
I think that's wonderful. Do we have any questions to do? Yeah, we have some questions for the audience.
I have one that came in, and then anyone else has a question, feel free to raise your hand. Just a quick reminder, questions around here typically begin with a W or an H and sometimes a D. So think in those terms when I bring the microphone to you if you have a question. The question that came in is, would you talk about the role of AI in game design? And it's a two-part question the gentleman asks. Would you describe the kind of games that perhaps were created to understand how viruses spread?
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions, although I have to say they're not especially pertinent to the type of work that I do, so I have to apologize to the individual who asked these questions. In that, I always say the games that I make are low on algorithms and high on social intelligence. The data or the algorithms, that comes in after the game is played when we're trying to analyze people's behavior. There's another type of simulation where the computer just plays it out and you put in, your parameters and your possibilities, and the computer spins up possible outcomes. That's not the kind of game that I create. Instead of having, all these algorithms and these just arbitrary data points, I want people to be the data points. And, I always say people are experts on their own futures. We need to create a way to allow them to share that expertise with experts in public health or epidemiology or climate action or whatever it is. So sadly, that would be my answer is I don't really work in that way, and I will not be giving.
That's kind of the opposite of what because the challenge to have an AI have social intelligence is like that's the opposite end of what you do. It seems like almost.
Well, true. I mean, like one of the other genres of games that I started working on in the early 2000s, I just was running around making up new genres of games. This is why they thought I was going to be a futurist. So I was like, okay, new genre, massively multiplayer science games. And what we'll do is scientists will give a bunch of problems to gamers, and they'll use their creativity and their flexibility and they'll just they don't mind chewing on something forever if it's really hard. They'll stay with it, and we should have them solve the problems that the computer programs have not been able to solve. And that actually did become a thing, like in protein folding, where the supercomputer was outperformed by ordinary gamers who learned how to use a 3D protein folding. So, I'm on that side. I'm on the side of give it to the people, and for now, the people beat the AI, but
do you believe that? The whole thing where the AI is going to take over, or the computer, is that a futurist thing that people? Because a lot of people in Silicon Valley do believe that.
Well, we will definitely become more reliant on AI, and it will be integrated in more of our everyday reality. Whether the algorithms will be helpful, effective, accurate, is to be determined. But, it's definitely going to be more common to rely on AI for decision making, but whether that will turn out to be better than traditional ways of,
it's hard
to be seen. I always say there's some futurists are self-described techno-optimists, and I say that I'm a socio-optimist, instead of trying to think about how technology is going to solve our problems, I try to think about how we're going to solve our problems.
Yeah, together. Yeah. We should still be in charge.
Yes, I think so. That is the ultimate takeaway.
Yes, hopefully.
Felicia and Jane say people
we
are still
should
in charge.
all still be in charge. Yes. Human beings. Hi.
Hi. My question is, it's kind of like a what-if scenario. But earlier tonight, you talked about futurism being kind of a toolkit or like an emotional skill set that people have. What do you envision the world looking like when more people think futuristically?
I love that. I mean, I feel like it will be easier to make changes, both at an individual, personal, behavioral level, but also in society. Like, we live in a time where anybody will say, it's so hard to change things. Why is it so hard? There's bureaucracy, there's inertia, there's opposition, there's lack of resources, lack of funding. What I imagine when this type of futurist thinking is a diverse skill set is that we'll remove some of the obstacles to change. So people will be able to overcome normalcy bias faster. It's just like our brain just really doesn't. Change is scary to the brain, and it does try to resist it often, just as a psychological safety tool, because if everything's always changing, it's overwhelming, right? But we can learn to overcome it when we're trying to create change, and we can learn to be more persuasive. You know, if I say, I really support, food as medicine, or I support geoengineering, I need to be able to convey to other people vividly what it might be like if we were to invest in this or adopt this policy. And so we become better communicators in the same way. Like, we have a lot of communication skills that we didn't have, 10 or 20 years ago. Remember when everybody got video cameras, and suddenly everybody could make their own movies, and we had a generation of people making movies, and then we got blogs, and suddenly everybody was a journalist, and then we got social media, and everybody's, curating, themselves as a brand. Like, we developed these communications skills and facilities. So I think the ability to tell stories about what is possible. I mean, I'm such a positive.
You are
person.
such a positive person. It's your charm and wonder.
I think about apocalypse, but then I think about it in a way that makes the world amazing.
I think that's amazing. I mean, I think that's all of us should have that, because again, the prevailing voice in all of our heads is completely opposite that.
Yeah.
And so we go back to it's just you're paralyzed. You're paralyzed to do anything on any scale whatsoever. And that's not the world that any of us kind of want to live in. And also, why live like that? Why should we? Sometimes I fantasize. I just want to go buy an old West town and just redo it and just have my friends live there. And I'm sure to turn into a horror film somehow. But like the idea, I think that's kind of the appeal of apocalyptic, like Walking Dead. And people do want to raise the ground and rebuild it and their own guy. Like, that's the fantasy, especially in the last 10 years of, Walking Dead and all these zombie. People want that to happen. Somewhere deep down, they want that because they feel so powerless, and they feel like that crisis, that complete wiping of humanity, of the establishment, is the only way to rebuild in the way that they think the world should be.
It's good. So we could say one thing that the book Imaginable will do is give you something better than a zombie apocalypse
to
fantasize about.
Because the skills you need for a zombie apocalypse are motorcycle repair, wound care. But definitely this is a better world to dwell in. Next question.
I was just wondering if you ever use virtual reality in any of your games or futuristic games.
Yeah. So I think one of the most exciting projects at the Institute for the Future right now is a virtual reality project where we're working with individuals who have recently been released, who've been incarcerated. And it's part of a project to see if we can reduce the rates in which people re-offend and are sent back to prison. And we're using VR to help them imagine scenarios that they might face that might get them in trouble and put them at risk of reoffending. And we worked with individuals in the system to design these scenarios. So like, what do you think you might, what scenarios can you imagine realistically encountering or that other people might encounter? And so we give people a chance to sort of just practice it so that when they face that future, which it's a much shorter time scale, like I usually am working at a 10-year time scale, but here they're imagining 6 months, a year. But the impact is the same as when you've pre-imagined it, you're processing the shock, you're feeling your feelings, you're able to think about the possible implications of actions you would take so that when you actually show up in this future, you're more in control of your actions and your emotions. And it's been really interesting. And we're just using the VR technology as an experiment to make it easier to imagine.
I mean, I think that's one. I mean, I'm a very anxious person, and one of the things, especially when I'm working, if I could see the space, if I could imagine the set, if I've, because the first time you do something is always when you're triggered, when you're, and so the idea that you could use VR to have people like do a dress rehearsal of scenarios, it seems like it'd be super therapeutic. I mean, I want that tomorrow, please.
And what's good about that project is, we try to establish a more participatory model of futures work, where instead of us coming in and saying, here's the future you have to get ready for, a drone comes in your backyard, and they're like, this is not something that happens in my community, here's what I think I should worry about. We're trying to, I just basically make this a much more inclusive field than it historically has been, and give people that skill set on their own. Once you learn how to imagine future scenarios, and you can take that with you and do it for any topic or context.
What?
Ooh, but the light's still on.
This is very cool.
The government-mandated internet shutdown begins.
Oh, no. I mean, I love that. I wanted it to happen.
Where do future forecasts most often stumble?
Yeah. Okay. I think... so this is the field is trying to fix, I think, a long-standing error that really came more to fruition during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is what I would say is essentially bad actors who are or people acting in bad faith, like doing things that seem so obviously incorrect or unethical. And you have to plan for that. I mean, whether it's planning for elected officials who are actively sabotaging efforts to deal with a crisis, or people trying to get rich by spreading misinformation and building almost like a cult following around it. I think historically, too many, especially in crisis prediction or risk scenarios, there's this presumption that people are going to try to help. And what's interesting is one of the first research encounters I had with future forecasting was actually from a video game. The CDC got really interested in this accidental pandemic that happened in the video game World of Warcraft, where there's like a bug in the program, and they were dealing all this damage, and people were dying. Like you would enter a place on the map, and just corpses everywhere, and one thing that they found happening was people were going into the danger zones to try to loot, and also they were like, I got to see it for myself. Like they called it looky-loo syndrome. And the CDC actually realized, based on what people were doing in this video game, maybe we need to start factoring in these what seem to us really stupid behaviors or dangerous or bad behaviors, but realistically anticipate that they might become risks that we need to address. And I think in general, there has been a failure to anticipate the full spectrum of bad faith actions that can play out. And,
to me, when I hear about billionaires buying up water supplies for climate change, I'm like, you're a terrible person. But that's the reality of what we're living now. Yeah. And I mean, you can just imagine the things that people will do when there are people needing to leave because there's literally no water in a country anymore.
Yeah, well, water wars. I mean, that's not
this book.
not in the book.
This book is about Optimism, and it
Yes.
really is fantastic.
But I mean, I think it's like, so one thing that I started doing in my forecasting games is I usually recruit a specific type of player, usually like the more hardcore gamers, not just like ordinary people, but hardcore gamers. And I'm like, your job is to F it up. Like, whatever everyone else says they're doing to help, like, try to stop them.
That's
Whatever
a
they
gamer.
build,
That's
try
gamer.
to break it. It's like, what I want to say is what arises from this is not a feeling of like, oh, people are terrible. It's actually empowering because you realize, like, I'm not going to stumble as or like I get it. I can see that coming, and we're going to be ready for it. And I think, there is a certain kind of confidence and clarity that you can only achieve when you're really realistically looking at human behavior and human psychology. And so even though it's like, you do have to think about stuff that's hard to think about, but ultimately you feel better.
Yeah,
for
because
doing
you
it.
know how to control. It's not going to be completely blindsiding you and smashing your faith in humanity.
Yeah.
Because you just need to think the lowest possible scenario, and you can be optimistic about it. One last question I think we have, right?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess my question is a little bit about, you're talking about climate migration, and we're hearing about VR. Where do you imagine in the future co-location or specificity of location becoming more or less important compared to where it is now? Because you could imagine, like, I've been working remotely for 2 years, right? Like, that's something that a lot of people have had to deal with. But are there certain things that right now we are expecting to experience physically that we might not, or vice versa?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think there will be greater flexibility of what we experience in a co-located fashion. So I'll give you an example. So I live in a part of California that now has a wildfire season, and a lot of parents of younger kids are worried about their kids being exposed chronically to the toxic air pollution, except it happens during the school year, and whereas like the normal parental instinct is we need to leave, but you're not allowed to pull the kids out for a couple months during wildfire season. So something that I'm seeing, the beginnings of like signals of change, like rumblings about, is does there need to be more flexibility in school as a place you go when there are new realities, like it may not be safe to be year-round in a particular, and so we talk about like seasonal migration. I don't think people want to give up, close, intimate co-location, but there may be a desire in the same way we're seeing, work from the office, but from abroad, like, where...
Yeah, digital nomad visas.
Yeah.
I'm an expert on those if you ever want to move abroad. I know everything about it.
Ah.
Yeah, and also I think, I was homeschooled, so I never went to school. So I've specifically found a school that will let me send my kid 4 days a week. And if I don't want her to go, I was like, well, if we go somewhere, that's fine. So, but that's just me. But I had lunch with somebody today whose child chose to go to high school. I guess in Minnesota, you can go to school anywhere. They've just instituted a change where you can, if you are a citizen of Minnesota, you can take high school wherever you want because every school, I guess, accommodates online learning. So she's enrolling in a school that's on the other side of the state, and yet that's where she's going to high school because it's such a great school.
Right.
So like it's mind-blowing because there were no options when I was a kid. My mom just raised me like a wolf.
But see, then you might see things forming, like as some stuff goes virtual, what fills the need for, local interaction or community. And I do think, to me, that's a very vibrant creative space right now. A lot of experimentation, a lot of opportunity to think about what we really want and need. So,
well, this is, it is a book that will definitely transform you in a positive way. Thank you for writing it. If anybody wants to get more involved in your experiments, the Future Institute, please let everybody know.
This is super cool. I'm proud to announce that the Institute for the Future has opened our first public center for social simulation and imagination training. It's online at Urgent Optimists, plural, because there's a whole bunch of us hanging out, .org. The URL is on the book cover. So if you get the book, it says join the community. And this is a place now where if you want to actually play the games in the book, there you will just pop in. We have about 1,000 people now. We just opened it a few weeks ago, but we're doing, in fact, this Monday is our first game night. We're playing one of my favorite games from the book. And we're running a scenario club. So once a month, we meet up to play with scenarios. And you know, this is just our, like, in my goal for the future, the biggest social simulation I've run had 20,000 people. How do we get to 20 million? So
yeah, that's amazing.
So now we have a public center.
And can you take people's data? Can you use their data, like anonymously or whatever, to help inform, you know, the things you're going to do in the world and in the future, and what you take from?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's really cool that you'll be able to contribute to that.
Yes, come play, and you know, if you can't figure out how to, you know, change everything in the world, at least you can add your imagination to this collective imagination, and hopefully help us anticipate what's next.
It's amazing. Oh, cool. Thank you so much for having me be here. You are such a fascinating person. I cannot wait to see what you do in the future, and always, it's such a pleasure to talk to you.